Recognize. Umbra Walker. D01. Recognize. The Caleb G. D02.
Hello, team. Welcome to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files, episode 10. I am everyone's favorite sidekick, Caleb, and I refuse to live in a world where every problem is solved in half an hour. Please allow me to introduce Rich, the law of last resort, Howard! Thank you so much for joining us here today. We absolutely appreciate your time here with this podcast. If you would like to get a hold of us, there are many ways to do so. You can, of course, find us on Twitter at the YJ Files. You can email us, whelmedpodcast@gmail.com, or swing over to our website, crashingthemode.com.
My name is Amanda Waller. I am not your mother, your maiden aunt, or your friend. I am your warden, and you are my prisoners.
And with all of that out of the way, let's turn it over to Rich for...
Hello, Megan.
All right, this week's title of the episode we are talking about is called Terrors. The release date was September 23rd. We are back on a weekly release schedule after the crazy 6-month hiatus. But don't you worry, it'll get crazy again. The in-episode date, there's 2 dates actually. There's September 14th in New Orleans for the pre-credit scene. And then September 16th, the rest of the episode takes place in Belle Reve for the most part. The director was one of my personal favorites, Jay Oliva. And the writer was Greg Weisman himself.
And this episode features some surprising voice talent beyond our normal cast. We got Dave Franco swinging in to do a voice, which is kind of crazy.
Dave Franco? Who's Dave Franco? Do I know him?
Wait, do you know the actor or do you know the character?
All of the above.
Dave Franco plays Edward Nygma.
Oh, okay.
He's the younger Franco brother.
I was going to say, is he related to Mr.
Yeah,
James?
he's the younger brother.
I did not know that.
And my preferred Franco. I think he's...
really?
I think he's pretty classy in his roles.
Oh, I'm gonna have to look him up because James Franco's kind of awesome.
Oh, I'm not saying he's not, but Dave Franco...
Oh, I think you did.
Well, you know what, Dave, if you're listening to this podcast, please email us, whelmedpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll set up a time to come on and we can defend yourself in this argument.
Yes. Well, I mean, James Franco, he's got like 6 PhDs and he's like a CIA agent or something, so he may just show up at your house.
Hey, that's fine. Let's hang out, James. I'm ready. You already know my address, I'm guessing. We also have people like Adrian Pasdar, who has been in some other cartoons, has a lot of other voice work, but I think he's most well-known from Heroes. And then, who else pops up? James Remar.
Oh, yeah.
He just does everything. He's everywhere. And I think what's funniest to me is the voice of Dr. Freeze is...
Mr. Freeze?
Whatever.
We're going to get angry letters, sir.
Whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. Keith, I'm going to pronounce this horribly wrong. I'm not even going to try it. Remember in the second Batman Nolan movie, the police officer who was in the cell or in the interrogation room with Joker?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's Dr. Freeze.
You did it again. You're just baiting people.
Maybe I am.
Doctor.
But in his non-supervillain role, he is a doctor.
He is actually a doctor. Your point is valid.
And his last name is Freeze.
That's right. Actually, it is. Dr. Mr. Victor. Dr. Mr. Victor.
Stay whelmed, people. Stay whelmed. It's just a name.
He was the only applicant, everyone. The only applicant.
All right. Well, enough shenanigans here. Let's get on to mission briefing so we stop this tangent.
Just in time for your next mission.
All right, guys. The pre-credit scene here, we open up in New Orleans where Superman and Martian Manhunter are stopping a 3-state rampage by 2 characters we haven't seen yet, Tommy and Tuppence Terror, a.k.a. the Terror Twins. The powerhouse superheroes toss the Terror Twins, knock them into a warehouse out of sight of the camera crews, because it's told from the point of view at the start of reporters of Cat Grant. If you've watched the live-action Supergirl, you know who Cat Grant is, and here she's a reporter. When they get into the warehouse, Aqualad and Red Tornado put inhibitor collars on the Terror Twins. We then see Superboy dressed to look exactly like Tommy Terror, and then McGann taking on Tuppence's appearance now that she can get close. Then Tommy's confused because he loses all of his strength and powers when he gets the collar on and says, "Somebody tell me what's happening." And Batman puts similar inhibitor collars on Connor and McGann in their disguises. That implies that the heroes will be arrested in the villain's place.
We then cut to a few days later. McGann and Connor, in their disguises, are in a transport vehicle heading to Belle Reve Penitentiary, a facility designed to hold superpowered villains. But Belle Reve is a prison as opposed to Arkham, which is an asylum. We get a flashback from McGann's point of view, showing Batman giving them their assignment. The 4 ice villains we saw being stopped in the very first episode have all been arrested. Cold and Frost were sent to Belle Reve. Freeze petitioned to be considered legally sane, so instead of going to Arkham, he ended up in Belle Reve. And Junior petitioned the court to be tried as an adult, so he was also sent to Belle Reve. Batman finds that understandably suspicious, so he has decided to send in Connor and McGann undercover.
Yep. Then we cut back to the transport that arrives at Belle Reve. McGann is put in the same cell as Killer Frost, while Connor gets the tour of the facility, quote-unquote, from Icicle Jr. Connor discovers that the man in charge on the inside, the prison capo, so to speak, is Icicle Jr.'s father, Icicle Sr., and overhears with his super hearing a plan to break every con out of Belle Reve. Connor and McGann remain in telepathic contact with one another and Aqualad, who is actually hiding in the bioship, camouflaged in the swamp outside of Belle Reve, for backup. Aqualad wants to pull them out, but McGann argues that they need more details, and Aqualad agrees.
So in the next scene, we have Connor and McGann, still in their disguises, meeting with Belle Reve's chief therapist, Dr. Hugo Strange.
Mr. Hugo Strange.
Mr. Hugo Strange. Dr. Mr. Doctor. Strange tries to get them to open up about their home life, and even though Connor doesn't talk, McGann decides to bring up Connor's issues with Superman.
In the guise of, our Pa's distant. Tommy wants to be like Pa. I didn't see it coming the first time. It was awesome. We cut back to, we continue to see Icicle Sr.'s plan kind of in motion with a few cutscenes. There's some gear smuggled into the facility that Mr. Freeze, Captain Cold, I bet he's not even a captain, Captain Cold and Icicle Sr. are cracking open this crate, and we assume that gear can be put together to make freeze-generating equipment. We see new prison orange suits delivered to the inmates, and Junior implies to Connor that they're important to the plan for some reason. Connor continues to play on Junior's kind of, unfortunately, need for a friend, which is really sad if you sit and think about it for a little bit. We then see Freeze attack Icicle Sr. in the mess hall, stating that he's done following orders. Of course, Freeze gets knocked unconscious by the guards using the inhibitor collars, and he's dragged to see Amanda Waller.
A communication breakdown between Icicle Sr. and Killer Frost in the women's wing gives Connor an opening. Connor bluffs Icicle Sr. into believing that Tommy and Tuppence have twin telepathy, convincing Icicle Sr. to use him to relay messages to the women's wing. He then learns that the jailbreak is going down as they speak. Back in Waller's office, Freeze uses the bracelets he built to freeze a guard. He takes Waller and Strange as hostages, and he turns off the inhibitor collars. Unfortunately, McGann breaks her cover to stop Killer Frost from murdering a guard, and Connor loses telepathic contact with her.
We see that part of the plan was to use the freezing technology that we just saw with Freeze in the previous scene to make the walls brittle enough for the stronger villains like Mammoth and Blockbuster to shatter the walls piece by piece. Earlier in the episode, Waller makes a comment about how the walls can hold Superman. We know, we checked, she says. But by freezing the walls and making them brittle, the villains are hoping that they can crack through them, and it seems to be working. Icicle Jr. and Connor are sent to a wall that adjoins the women's wing, to do the same thing. Killer Frost and, in this case, Devastation, who we don't get much in season 1, but we see her more in season 2. They're breaking through into the men's wing from the women's wing on the other side, so they're there to meet him. Connor knows that he has to take out as many inmates as possible if he's going to save Megan, if she's even still alive. So he convinces Icicle Jr. to help him get into the main office, where he manages to turn the collars back on, again playing off Icicle Jr.'s sad need for a friend.
So Connor and Junior eventually get through the wall to find McGann frozen in a block of ice by Killer Frost. Connor takes Devastation and Frost down, but isn't sure what to do about McGann, but then she frees herself. The jailbreak is now thwarted, and we cut to a scene of Hugo Strange being put in place as the warden in Waller's stead. And then we find out that Strange was responsible for smuggling in the gear and is now in a perfect position to help the Light with their plans.
Yeah. Oh my. I got some Aster.
We got some Aster. Yeah, let's go ahead and feel the Aster here.
Superboy, are you alright?
I'm fine. Feeling the Aster.
Hugo Strange therapy session is probably the highlight of this whole episode. Great character development on 2 points. Bringing up Superboy's issues with Superman, but also Connor making a comment about McGann's overly optimistic view of the world and how things work. Great counterpoint considering that we also just saw them starting a relationship as well, which I think is interesting. The callback to the ice villains in the first episode. So we made a comment back then in the Crashing the Mode in that first episode that these villains were going to come back. So Mr. Freeze saying, enjoying family time. My family has different plans. And it was kind of a throwaway line a little bit back then, and we probably wouldn't have thought about it again, except we realized, oh, wait, this is the plans he was referring to back, 11 episodes ago in the very opening scene. So once again, and again and again and again, these nods to the writers have a plan. Also, there's this great running joke with Oho and Superboy. Superboy kicks Oho's butt in Infiltrator, the episode Infiltrator. And so Oho keeps recognizing him, but he's like, wait a minute, I know you. And the first time, McGann actually is able to implant a suggestion in Oho's mind that he really is Tommy Terror. But then later on in the episode, that starts wearing off, and Oho starts to remember again, and then Superboy just knocks him unconscious. It's just this cute running joke that is a great throwback to previous scenes in the series, which I always love when they do that. It just, again, feels like it's the bigger world where things have consequences.
There was a whole lot about this episode that I loved. I love the fact that we got to see Belle Rev.
Oh, yeah.
I loved all of these other characters that showed up.
Oh, Waller, too. Just the whole Waller thing, too. Yeah, absolutely.
Waller is so fantastic in this episode.
We know, we checked.
That's one of my favorite parts, because I always envisioned them building Belle Rev and then sticking Superman inside of it just to see if he could get out. This episode is one of those really tight, really focused episodes. There's not a whole lot happening outside of the walls of Belle Rev.
Yeah, that's true.
But the show does it really, really well. We've had episodes that are big and wide-reaching. They show us the whole scope of the DC universe in Universe 16 here.
Mm-hmm.
But this one is very focused. And it works. There's no problems with that. And I think that's what I like about it so much. The show is demonstrating it can handle both extremes of focus.
Yeah.
I loved seeing Strange and Freeze working together.
Mm-hmm.
They're some of my, I don't want to say favorite villains, but they're some of the villains I appreciate a lot. Mostly because Freeze is a very real and tragic villain.
Yeah, he really is.
We don't see as much of his human side in this episode. He's much more the supervillain terror that he is. But knowing the history of the character, he's a very intriguing villain. One of my favorite parts about this is how easily Connor stepped into the role of planner and manipulator.
Yeah, he starts thinking so much more in this episode.
Mm-hmm. This is very much Connor is on his own. And instead of just starting a fight like we've seen him do so many times before, we see him thinking.
Yep. When he realizes that McGann has gone and he's trying to get through the walls to her, I mean, old Superboy would have just kept punching through that wall, and doing what he can do. Instead, he stops. Thinks I've got a whole prison full of people here that will stop me from getting out. So, yeah, I've got to do something else.
I love that part of the development here because we're really seeing Connor evolve as a character.
Yep.
And I very much appreciate that with how much I enjoy that character. There were a couple things I wasn't a huge fan of in this episode, very, very minor. One of them, unfortunately, is with Mr. Freeze. He has such a lame weakness. I'm sorry, man. If we just have to crack your helmet and you go down for the count, get some Gorilla Glass. Get some duct tape. Come on, man.
Hey, he did get punched by Superboy. Come on.
That's true.
It may have been Gorilla Glass.
But it's one of those things, especially with Batman villains. Mm-hmm. They all have one very exploitable weakness. Mm-hmm. And it only ever gets exploited when it needs to be.
Maybe. I'll make a counterpoint to that, though. In the first episode that we see Freeze in, Robin throws stuff at his helmet, and it cracks, but it doesn't go down. It isn't until, Batman comes on the scene. And we don't even know what happened. We know that Batman punches him, but we don't know what happened after that. So at least in this, I'll give the counterpoint that, yeah, but he got punched by Superboy. I'll give him that. Also, it was kind of cool to see him shoot himself in the face with ice just to stay alive. And he's like, I have to take myself out of this fight or I'm going to die. I'm not going to argue too much with you. It's pretty lame.
And another thing, we touched on this briefly, when Connor and McGann got sent into prison, they were loaded up with fake inhibitor collars. And one of the details here is that Bel Rev runs on these real inhibitor collars that suppress the metahuman superpowers of all of the inmates. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Connor and McGann's collars were fake, so they still had access to their powers.
Yeah.
But you would think that the prison would have other fail-safes in place. McGann's telepathy with Connor works the whole time because their inhibitor collars are fake. But why doesn't Bel Rev have a telepathy blocker on top of the collars?
Oh, you mean like an anti-telepathy field?
Yeah.
Or something like that? Yeah, I hear you. I'm okay with technology not doing everything. Just because you think something should work a particular way doesn't mean there's technology available for that. There isn't really any precedence, right? And on the same point, how did they stop teleporters from coming in and out, right?
Right.
We're thinking fantasy role-playing game kind of situation where there's anti-magic fields and general shutting down of things, But I think the collars for me, I guess it worked because it harkens back to how Champions, the superhero role-playing game, worked. You could have a drain on powers, but you had to pretty much make it a very specific kind of drain for a very specific kind of power. And that kind of makes sense, right? In the comic book Powers, they have a power dampening light. It's this field that gets generated. That's how they interrogate supervillains and whoever in their interrogation rooms, as they turn on this green light that inhibits all superpowers. Well, not all superpowers are the same, right? Freeze doesn't actually have... The only superpower Freeze has is that he doesn't get affected by cold. He's basically his cold resistance. Cold immunity. That's basically his power. The rest of it is all technology and gear. Captain Cold doesn't even have that. He's just got a parka. Yeah, I don't know. I'm okay without the telepathy field, but it does bring up an interesting point about what other things you can do. In this instance, you needed it for the plot, but we've already run into Simon, and we're going to run into other characters who have mind control and telepathic powers, So what prevents, if somebody's not in the jail, is that kind of your point too?
I think ultimately that is my point. If someone is outside Bel Rev, mm-hmm. and they are trying to break in or sneak in. So let's say Simon was trying to sneak into Bel Rev. He's obviously disguised himself or fogged the mind of the hapless guards.
Put on a hat to cover his brain.
He's just a hood. I mean, he just wears a hoodie.
Right,
totally
just a
fine.
hoodie. Just a hoodie.
Right. So if he's walking into Bel Rev to try to mind control Waller or sneak somebody out, if he's not an inmate, what's to stop him from using his powers?
No, that's a fair point.
Right. With Bel Rev supposed to be so secure and the best prison in the world, I expect a little bit more. But minor detail, ultimately it's a comic book, and comic books work at the speed of plot. And this is how the plot needed it to work, so it's okay. That's
fair. But I mean, in defense of your point, there are two things I'm going to bring up during the Canary Debrief that are kind of parallel the thing that you're talking about here. I love this episode. I loved everything about this episode. There were a couple of plot things that made me go, oh, that's interesting that they didn't fix that hole. Again, it's one of those things I think we were talking about in Happy Harbor and some of the other episodes. Whenever there's something that doesn't work quite right, like the inconsistent animation of Artemis's compound bow, because the rest of the show shines so brightly, these little bumps just jump out and make you go, I wonder why that got through.
Oh yeah. This is one of my absolutely favorite episodes. I love the action. I love all the characters that show up. I love this part of the DC universe. Bel Rev is so cool. That's why these little tiny details are under the spotlight at this point. But with all that out of the way, I think we do need to swing over to our Canary Debrief and keep talking about all of this.
Let's do it.
Stick around. Class is in session.
So, as we just mentioned, Caleb brought up, there's some things that made him go, during this episode. And there are a couple of things that jumped out at me as well. I can't remember that I caught them necessarily the very first time I watched the episode. But there's two things that jump out on the plot front. So, according to Batman, no one in the facility was supposed to know that Connor and McGann were in there because they couldn't be sure that any of the staff members weren't compromised. Which is great. Makes perfect sense. Also ramps up the danger part. Yet, randomly then, apparently, they were both put into the cells of the people they needed to be in the cells with. So, Killer Frost and Icicle Jr. So, that's a bit odd. I can kind of give it a pass, just thinking like, well, maybe Batman told the prison, we want this to happen, but didn't just, his point is still valid. If he had said like, look, we want the Terror Twins in with these people because we want to track them or whatever. That still covers what he said, which was that nobody knows that the Terror Twins are not the Terror Twins. He can still make the request of Waller to have them housed with these other people. And Waller, in this particular series, would probably go along with it. So it's okay, but it just kind of stuck out a little bit. And then there's a pretty key plot point here that doesn't really get explained. So there's no explanation about why the communications between Icicle Sr. and Killer Frost went down. We don't know what that communication was supposed to be, and it just so happens that Sr. is talking to Jr. and saying, our communication with Killer Frost went down, and Superboy happens to be nearby enough to overhear. And so that's when he steps in and says, oh, hey, my sister and I had this telepathy we got in utero. We don't tell anybody about it because, they're slapping inhibitor collars on people. And if they don't know what our powers are, then they can't stop them from working. So you talk to me and I'll talk to my sister and she'll talk to Killer Frost, and that's great. It's a fantastic plot point for getting into that information stream. The problem is like a big part of the last part of this episode hinges on that having happened, and it was not engineered by the main characters. And we don't know why this communication route went down. It's a little bit big for me, which is going to bring me into my final point, which is I love this episode. I think this episode is a fantastic episode. Pointing out two potential plot holes, but one really, really big plot hole, at least storytelling hole, it doesn't stop me from loving this episode. So my point is, you can only do what you can do. There's got to be a point when you're writing something where you need to, first of all, finish it. Finish the thing that you're writing, right? Then you can go back and edit it. But even when you're editing it, you need to let go of what you're doing. You can edit something for years, and it still won't be good enough for you. You need to get it out there, get it public, and move on to the next project. You need to learn from whatever mistakes you learn in retrospect from that and move on to the next step. The only reason that these things jump out in this particular episode is, again, because Greg Weisman and the showrunners and the writers are really, really good. And because of that, this is something that jumps out at me as like, that's an odd thing to miss. I can't see them sitting around the story room and someone not pointing that out. So it makes me wonder if it was actually in a script somewhere and they ended up having to edit it out just for timing or that kind of thing. I just can't see Greg Weisman missing something like that. But that's it, really. Take it away, man. You just finish the thing that you're doing. Finish whatever it is. Get it done. Get it edited. Do the best you can. Move on to the next project and learn. That's the Canary Debrief.
Well, something else along those same lines. We both on this show here come from a role-playing game, tabletop game background. And a lot of times in tabletop gaming, since usually you're creating the story on the fly or reacting to the choices your players make, sometimes these plot holes do come up.
Yeah.
And in a tabletop game, unlike a finished television show or movie, you have another level of solutions to this problem. Because even if a plot hole develops, you can readdress that situation at a later point in the game.
Yeah.
So, for example, let's say this same jailbreak plot was happening in a tabletop game I was running. And I knew that communication had to break down for the rest of the game to happen. And either I couldn't think of a good idea or I didn't realize it until too late. I just say communication breaks down and we're going from this point forward.
Mm-hmm.
If the players pick up on this potential plot hole and they say, hey, wait a minute, why did communication break down? Well, now we've opened another game session. Now we have another side quest that I can then just fill in the blanks later on and make a better story.
Right. I look at these kind of games, like our role-playing games, as first draft stories, right? That you can go back and fix on the fly or edit on the fly or retcon on the fly. If you're writing a novel and you find out, so you write this 80,000 word middle grade fiction book and you realize that Tommy at the end of the book needs to have a pocket knife in his pocket to have everything come together at the very end. He needs to have a pocket knife. You can go back to the rest of your book before you're done, instead of just have the pocket knife show up, like introduce the pocket knife at the very beginning and then maybe make a reference to it in the middle somewhere, kind of follow that, mention it a couple of times thing. And then the pocket knife is like, oh yeah. And if the reader remembers like, oh, he's got a pocket knife in his pocket, I wonder if he's going to remember that. And he does, then it's great. If they don't remember it, then they'll be like, oh, that's fantastic. Like, oh, I'd totally forgotten about that. That's great. That's what you can do in a role-playing game. When I see something like a pocket knife show up at the end of a story and there's no precedence for it and it's a Deus Ex Machina, that feels like, yeah, this is a first draft script. Somebody needs to go back. This needed some more edits. I don't know how this got through, right? It's so obvious that you just need to take another pass at it. Right? In role-playing games, like you're saying, we can fix that stuff. And even it even generates more and interesting stories because the players are pointing out things. What I pictured was the mechanic in Edge of the Empire where you have light side and dark side points that you can flip back and forth. And when you flip a light side point to a dark side point and expend that, you can change an element of the story. So in that example you're saying, I can see like, oh, the characters are trying to break out. What do we need? Oh, you know what we need? We need their communication to break down so that we can use the Force telepathy to move the plot forward. Let's flip a light side point and say, oh, whatever their communication is broke down. It's not important necessarily what that communication was, but the players have added this element that the storyteller, the GM, can actually grab onto and say like, oh, I guess they must have had a communication route, huh? Oh, let me see if I can make that more interesting.
Michael, the host of the RPG Academy podcast, has a fun little habit of whenever a plot hole develops or whenever something doesn't work out exactly right and might need a retcon or something, and a player says, hey, wait a minute, what about XYZ? That doesn't make any sense. His trick, his habit is to say, yep, isn't that weird? And just move on with the story.
Yep. By the way, for those people who don't know retcon is mostly a gaming term, but it's used in writing sometimes too, and it means retroactive continuity. It means something, we said X 4 episodes ago, but we're going to say now that instead of saying X, we had pretend we had said Y. It doesn't work great in a TV series, and that just kind of makes me, when it does happen, and sometimes it does, it jumps out. But in role-playing games, we do it all the time because we have to. Because that story is being created first draft on the fly with a room full of people whose imaginations are all, hopefully working together, but also sometimes clashing. So, and people just forget things like, oh, wait, you said six games ago that the guy's name was John instead of Jim. And like, yeah, well, he's John now. Just pretend it was John the whole time.
And by saying, oh, isn't that weird? That's kind of a way just to provide a little bit of an in-game plot hook.
Yeah.
And to help you remember as the GM, as the guy or girl kind of leading the story, that you might need to go back and figure something else out and add in that side quest or that other plot thread.
Yeah. At least know that the players may pull on that thread.
Right. It's a way to remind yourself to get prepared.
Right. Exactly. It's a great mental bookmark. I like it.
Yep. All right, so I think that's enough of a debrief there. Why don't we move on to crashing the mode?
Yeah, let's do it.
Tell us something we don't know yet.
Sorry, BB. We can't risk altering the time stream. We do that, we're all feeling the mode.
As always, in crashing the mode, we are talking about spoilers for this episode, for the rest of Young Justice as a series, and we're touching on some spoilers and Easter eggs for the DC universe overall. If you do not want to be spoiled for Young Justice specifically, please stop listening and join us later.
All right, here we go. So I think the highlight, and I mentioned this during the body of this episode, is the Hugo Strange therapy session. First of all, if you know Hugo Strange is a Batman villain who, like a lot of Batman villains, can be written in a humorous way, which he kind of was a little bit in this episode, but also in a bit of a horrifying way. He's basically uses psychology and the science of the mind to mess with people. So to have any hero in a therapy session with Hugo Strange was, ooh, and then to have them open up. And the way it was handled was really interesting because it moves the plot forward, it gives information, and it creates character development for, in this case, both Superboy, but also Superboy's offhand comment about, maybe I don't want to live in the world where Tuppence lives, where every problem can be solved in half an hour. Again, the first time you watch this, you don't necessarily get this reference. It just seems like, oh, they're kind of making a nod to the fact that feels like a bit of a cliche stereotype of a sitcom girl. Of course, later on we find out she is a stereotype of a sitcom girl because she's modeling herself, her physical and mental humanness off of this Megan Morse character from a TV show. So foreshadowing and nod to what's coming in the future as well that I didn't notice until, I don't know, probably the third round through the series.
One of the other very small little foreshadowing details here, Edward Nygma, the Riddler, has a very small role as a background character in Belle Rev. I find it very interesting that he's in Belle Rev and not Arkham, because he's typically an Arkham inmate.
Right. And he even comments about that in the episode he shows up in later.
At the very final scene of this episode, it's noted that he actually did escape during all these shenanigans.
Right.
But no one cares. Right. Oh, it's just Nygma.
Just Nygma.
What's he gonna do? Go paint a riddle on a wall with some spray paint? No one cares.
He's a running joke through the whole episode, which makes it even funnier that, of all of the powerhouses that were making fun of him, he's the one who actually got out.
But he does return in later episodes, and he's actually part of the final plot that is resolving for this first season of Young Justice. So that is a little bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah. Speaking of Nygma too, it is interesting that there are some big-name villains for Batman specifically that are downplayed. So it's the opposite effect of them taking a character like freaking Sportsmaster and making him awesome. You're taking Nygma that everybody knows who Riddler is, and you're making him a doofus, I'm quoting Brick. And he's not insane. He's just a criminal who's actually pretty smart, fairly smart. But it's almost like he's trying too hard to have a supervillain shtick. And I really am entertained by this take instead of having someone like Nygma who gets front and center in so many other animated series and shows kind of take a back seat so some other characters can shine.
And that's another good part about this episode. There's not a whole lot of spoilers and secrets in it, but this episode is a showcase for a lot of side villains
Yeah.
and other characters.
Yeah. And callbacks, too. It's a lot of callbacks.
I think the best part of this episode, other than the therapy session, is the payoff from episode 1 of the ice villains, and this is what they were working on.
Right, exactly.
So this is kind of the fulfillment episode for those spoilers.
Right.
But just seeing side characters like Brick, who we only saw in episode 3 when Red Arrow was taking him down.
Right.
Well, Speedy before he became Red Arrow.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then we also see Hook, who was part of the Infiltrator episode that was trying to kill Dr. Roquette.
Abra is in here again.
From the Dr. Fate episode. And then, of course, we already mentioned about the Oho running gag with Superboy. So you know how you were talking about how Young Justice does a really good job of showing the entirety of the DC, like the galaxy of the DC universe in some cases when we get into season 2. And in this episode, it mostly takes place in, one set piece. And the show can handle both. It does stay in one set piece, but it's almost like it's highlighting the non-Justice League side of the DC universe, right? It's showing the wider world of villains in the DC universe, and also showing this inertia of connection. Again, consequences. All of these little tiny things that show consequences. Brick got arrested. What happened to Brick? I don't know. It's a comic book. I don't know. What do they do with them? They throw them in jail, but then they get out? Like, that's what happens. Well, now you see Brick from one episode, Hook from another episode, Abracadabra from another episode, right? Oho from another episode. All characters that we're familiar with now that have been arrested by the heroes. Now we know where they go. Now we know what's happening with them. It gives, again, this richer live feel that something's happening behind the scenes, even when the superheroes are doing something else. It's subtle, but it adds to the depth of the show, the feeling that you get. I love it.
And there's one last detail I've just thought of here. We talked a little bit earlier how cool and interesting it was to see Connor thinking on his feet and planning tactically.
Yep.
Later on, we learned something very important about where Connor might get some of these planning and manipulation skills.
Jesus. Oh my goodness, you kind of blew my mind there a little bit.
Now, this is something we've alluded to.
Sorry, I'm recovering from that. I don't want any of that to be true, Caleb.
I think it is, though. I really think it is.
No, it totally is, and I don't want any of that to be the case.
So we've alluded several times to the fact that Connor, while he is a clone of Superman, he also has human DNA. We have made the decision, even though we're talking about spoilers, to not spoil where that human DNA comes from, because that moment is so amazing.
We'll talk about it, but closer to the Revelation episode, I think. Yeah.
Right. But in retrospect, knowing that fact and seeing how Connor acts in this episode, wow.
It makes way more sense now, because as I'm watching this episode, as Icicle Jr., he's just sad. I mean,
he's such a poor little lonely kid. He just wants to be admired by his dad. He is Connor.
Yeah, he's the supervillain version of Connor.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and he's actually got powers, and his dad doesn't. Which is also this really interesting twist, to me. Yeah, it is the opposite. It's literally the opposite of Superboy. The flip side of that coin. Right? His dad should be jealous that Junior has powers, and maybe, you know what? Maybe he is. Let's dive into a little psychology here. Maybe he is jealous that his son has powers and he doesn't. That he got powers as a side effect of the experiments that Senior was doing. And that's why he's a crap dad. Besides the fact that, he's a villain and a jerk. But just, maybe there's something extra on top of that. Because he goes out of his way. He goes out of his way to insult his son. Mm-hmm. Oh, that Tommy Terror guy's got some cojones or whatever he says. He's just like, yeah, it's a kind of bravery I'd like to see in a man would like to see in his own son. His son is standing in the room with him. He doesn't even say, like, I wish my son was like that. He doesn't even acknowledge he even has one. It's just terrible. It's a terrible thing. And then Superboy manipulates that. Oh, you're some kind of super genius, super villain mastermind. Come on, Connor. Yeah, they're villains, but like, I really feel for Icicle during this whole thing.
Yeah. Knowing that Connor has seen this dynamic in this relationship, and he has made the choice to use that for his own ends. Oh.
It's great for the episode, and it's exactly what we're talking about, seeing Connor grow and change and start thinking and that kind of stuff. But then once you realize where the other half of his DNA comes from, you realize, oh God, please don't open that file. Go back to being a brooding, angry teenager. You don't want to dive too deep into that pool, buddy.
Right. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up our crashing the mode here, and let's move on to some fan service. Let's get out of this depressing spiral about Connor.
Love you, Connor. Yeah, let's do that. Our fan service this week is from another AMV from GT Grandom, and it's fantastic. And this one is to the Imagine Dragons song Demons. It pulls in a lot of stuff from season 2. It's I don't know what to say. It's fantastic. As with all of the AMVs, we give you a warning. They pull plot lines and scenes and things that are 100% major spoilers. My recommendation, only watch the AMVs if you've seen both seasons at least once, then see what you think from there. But having said that, this one's pretty fantastic. Thanks, GT Grandom.
If you are another creator out there of fan art, music videos, anything about Young Justice or the larger DC universe, please get in touch with us. We feature fan art on our website every week. We feature music videos. We feature different resources and wiki pages on our website, crashingthemode.com. Please get in touch with us, and we would love to get you featured out there and spread the Young Justice love and appreciation. And with all that being said, I think it is time to wrap up this mission and head out of the cave. Thank you again for listening, and remember to feel the Aster.
And hashtag keep binging YJ on Netflix and stay whelmed.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.